Ali Cupper is the independent member for Mildura. Great to have you with us again on Flow.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks for having me.
Now, there's a bit of, let's call it energy being expressed in Melbourne, even some people having a snooze out on the steps of Parliament. Just on this pandemic powers legislation, just for the record, where did you vote on that one?
Yes, I voted a couple of weeks ago and I voted against it. At the time, it was rushed and I didn't have enough time to consider it. My electorate obviously has had some fairly unique experiences through lockdowns and border closures, and we didn't have a lot of patience for new rules and how those rules might look. So certainly I wasn't going to support it unless I was confident about the content, and I couldn't be confident about the content in such a short time frame.
Okay, well then moving on to these other topics that you're raising, and you think you might have found a way to help our local councils actually be on top of their budgets when they really don't have the rate base to support all the infrastructure works they've got to do.
Yeah, and look, I mean, councils for the most part are on top of their budgets. The issue is who's shouldering that burden, and the burden sits on the shoulders of rural and regional ratepayers in a far disproportionate way compared to their metro counterparts. A farmer in Buloke, for example, is paying 6 times the amount of rates as a resident in Stonington with properties of the same value. That's a scandalous disparity, and to fix it, it's not rocket science. Number one, what the government can do with the assistance of the federal government is to provide a lifeline. So we're suggesting $30 million per year recurrent grants straight to those most disadvantaged rural and regional councils. What they could do, like say a Buloke, and what that they have indicated in principle is that they would put half towards direct rate relief and half towards roads, which would deliver obviously obvious benefits to residents. The other mechanism, which would fix it once and for all, would be an equalisation funding system. So that's something that's been touted by the VFF for a long time. Essentially, that would mean that there would be one uniform rate in the dollar right across the state, and that would be centrally collected and then redistributed to councils based on need, and that would fix it. That would see average rates in Mildura, for example, drop by around $800 a year.
Now, just on this, the number of councils you identified that are disadvantaged, have you got a few particularly in mind, or is there a formula that would identify who really needs the help from this initial funding you're proposing?
The formula has been well established. It's called the Whelan model. So that provides an objective measuring tool for financial disadvantage or capacity to pay, and so that's what's been used to identify where all councils in the state sit. And $30 million is the figure that would allow 13 councils, in my proposal at least, the ability to provide meaningful rate relief for their residents.
And those councils include a few from your electorate, I gather?
Yeah, I tend to be a bit biased, Ricky.
That's your job. That's what people vote for.
That's right, exactly. So I'm not going to be shy about that. Yeah, so Buloke and Yarriambiack would be within that list. But obviously, I mean, because this is a statewide policy, I can't just ask for new rules for mine. You've got to ask for new rules that would benefit disadvantaged councils across the state. So that recurrent grant scheme would immediately assist Buloke and Yarri, but the equalisation funding system, which would be the more sort of permanent long-term solution, that would help all of my councils. So that would include Mildura and Swan Hill and all the other rural and regional councils.
So the funding you're talking about in the short term and even longer term would come from state or federal governments, which is effectively the whole sort of base of taxpayers across the state?
Yeah, well, I don't really care where it comes from. It's just got to come from somewhere. So either the state could say, look, we're going to sign this in consolidated revenue, which is what the Napthine Baillieu government did under their local government minister Jeanette Powell years ago when they were in government, right? So there was that. So it can be done from consolidated revenue, but alternatively, the federal government would be able to make an adjustment to the criteria or the formula for allocating the federal assistance grants. That would mean that the federal government wouldn't be paying anything more. It would just mean that the state government would have more flexibility in how they can distribute the $600 million they get per year, and they'd be able to direct more of that to the smallest councils that need it, and less of it to the big metro councils who are swimming in cash. So that would be those two key ways, or it could be a combination of both to get that $30 million.
And I guess regardless of what metropolitan people might feel about that redirection of funding, there's a greater experience of tourism in our regional areas during the pandemic that shows there's an appreciation country people have for regional opportunities.
Well, that's right, and we're growing their food, So it's important for metro ratepayers or for metro residents to have the rural and regional areas to be viable and thriving and livable. We are all interconnected in that way. It's not in the interest of metro ratepayers to have, regional and rural areas where people are leaving. We want to have local food, and so that's the connection. That's the connection between metro and regional ratepayers. And I guess the other side is that an injustice is an injustice. If metro ratepayers have been, getting this unfair advantage for years and years and years, well then they should just feel lucky for that. Eventually, the pendulum's got to swing back. We've got to level that playing field. If it's an injustice, it needs to be fixed. And those big councils that have a whole lot of money because they've got all of these advantages that put, downward pressure on their costs, they can absorb this change, and they indeed need to. And so that's why we're going to be pushing as hard as we can.
Well, Ali Cupper, keep us updated on how that progresses would be good news for Buloke and Yarriambiack residents. Thanks for joining us today on Flow.
No worries. Thanks, Ricky.